You've met a man that agreed with everything you said. He nodded at the right moments. He finished your feeling before you'd finished saying it. You walked away certain that someone at last had understood you. What you couldn't have known, and what he didn't know either, is that he had no thoughts of his own left to disagree with. He'd given them all away, one at a time, and never once felt them go. We think of a mind as something that you feel, a thing that grows richer the more it takes in. We rarely think that a mind can also be emptied, not by force, but by agreement, handed away so gently that a man can lose the whole of himself and mistake it, right to the end, for simply getting along. His name was Andy, and in his village he was famous for being easy. Ask him about the harvest and he'd give you back the words of the last farmer on the road. Ask him about the sermon and he'd hand you the verdict of whoever he'd walked home beside. He never argued, and never had to, so there was no one more welcome at a table, no one warmer to sit beside, because to be near Andy was to be agreed with, and there are few warmer feelings a man can offer another. Andy kept a closet by his door, and in it hung a coat from every man he knew. He didn't sew them, he didn't buy them. Each had been handed to him by somebody else. The miller's certainty, the innkeeper's grievances, his brother-in-law's politics. Every morning, before he stepped outside, he put on whichever coat the last person had left in his hands, and whichever coat he wore, that was the man he was that day. It was warm, he was never cold, and he was never wrong. He was never once alone in a single thing he thought, because he never thought a single thing alone. And the borrowing grew. It cost nothing to borrow a man's opinion of the weather, but Andy borrowed far more than weather. He took the views of the school teacher from the gossip at the well and distrusted a good woman that he'd never met. He took his view of his oldest friend from a man who envied him and let a friendship of 30 years go cold for reasons that were never his. In the end, he kept no verdict of his own, not on his wife's cooking or his son's trade or the house he'd lived in all his life. And if you'd asked him plainly what he loved, he would have paused and reached, out of habit, for someone else's answer. The coats grew heavy. A man who agrees with everyone must, in the end, wear someone else's coat at some point. So Andy took to wearing 3 and 4 at once, layered against the smallest chance of being caught without an opinion. He grew warm and wide and slow and called it comfort. He could barely lift his own arms, but he was never, for one moment, cold. Then, one gray afternoon, near the end of a long winter, his granddaughter climbed onto the bench beside him. She'd spent the morning drawing, and she held up 2 pictures, one in each little hand. "Grandfather," she said, "which one is better?" It was the easiest question in the world. Andy opened his mouth, and he reached, the way he always had, for what someone else would say. He listened for the room, but the room was quiet, and there was no coat in the closet for that child's 2 drawings. No one had ever told him which one he liked. And Andy felt something he hadn't felt in 40 years. The cold. Not the cold of the winter air. The cold of standing in his own closet in front of a child and finding he didn't know his own mind. He looked at her hopeful face, and behind it, he seemed to catch a glimpse of himself. An old man of 60 who could tell you what every soul in the village believed, and yet couldn't tell you one thing that he believed. A man who'd spent his whole life keeping warm and had never once been himself. Andy didn't figure this out all at once. He found himself in stages. First came the panic. He wanted to bolt back to the closet, to seize any coat, any voice, and hand the child a borrowed answer, to be warm again. His hands moved towards the door, to have no opinion felt, in that moment, like having no face, like being marched naked in the middle of the square. "Say the bird," 100 old whispers told him. Everyone would say the bird. Then came the remembering, not as a thought, but as a slow procession of quiet pictures. The schoolteacher he'd mistrusted for years on a stranger's word. He had never once gone to meet her. His oldest friend's face at a door he'd let swing shut, over an opinion a jealous man had handed him, like a coat. His wife setting down a plate, waiting, just waiting for him to say whether he liked it. And Andy answering only, "However you think is best, dear." His son, young and frightened, asking whether to leave for the city, and Andy, a father, with a whole heart full of an answer, reaching instead for the borrowed words of the man at the inn. He'd been asked so many times what he thought, and every time he had gone to the closet. And then, at last, came the quiet. Andy looked down at the two drawings, held up patiently in two small hands, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't listen for the room. He let the coats fall, not with his hands. There was no closet to walk to, but somewhere inside he let them drop, one after the other, all the warm and borrowed voices, until he stood in the cold of his own bare mind with nothing on at all. And he looked, with his own two eyes, at a child's two drawings, and he found, to his astonishment, that he did have a preference, that it had been there the whole time, small and unhurried, waiting under 50 years of other men's coats. This one, he said quietly. He touched the messier of the two, a crooked little house with the sun drawn far too big above it. This one, because it looks like ours. It was the smallest opinion a man could have. It was cold and plain and entirely his own. And it did not feel like loss. It felt like a window thrown open in a room that had been shut for 50 years. A single thought had risen up from somewhere deep inside him and belonged to no one else alive. And the cold of it, he understood now, had only ever been the cold fresh air. Something in his chest came loose. He felt absurdly close to tears, not from grief, but from the plain, astonishing relief of it. For one moment, entirely being himself. And the child smiled up at him as though he'd handed her something made of gold. He thought he reached the happy ending of a story. He was wrong. The story had one more thing to teach him, and it waited until the spring. For Andy had opinions now, and he learned what they cost. At the inn one evening he said gently that he thought the miller was wrong about the new bridge, and the long table that had laughed beside him for 30 years went quiet, and didn't laugh the same way again. He told his brother-in-law kindly that he didn't agree about the council, and his brother-in-law's face closed slowly, like a door easing shut. People still nodded to him on the road, but they stopped stopping. The most agreeable man in the village had become a man you were careful around, one who might hand your own opinion back to you, changed, or not take it at all. And the warmth of the village drew back from him, the quiet way heat leaves a room when the fire burns down. Here, Andy understood what all those easy years had truly cost him. It wasn't the arguments he'd avoided. It wasn't even the opinions he'd never owned. It was that no one, not one soul in 60 warm and welcome years had ever actually met him. They had loved the man who always agreed. They had been warm to the coats, but the coat is not a man. And so not one of them had ever once been warm to Andy, because Andy, agreeable to the very last, had spent his whole life making certain that he had never been in the room. He'd been beloved his whole life and alone inside it, never knowing the difference. And that, he saw at last, was the cost of being agreeable. Not the arguments you lose, but the man you slowly agree not to be. And for a while, that was the whole of it. Andy had his own mind at last, and it cost him the warm, crowded life he'd always known. The evenings stretched out longer now. The bench outside his door, where men had once gathered to hand him their opinions like coats, sat empty in the cool of the day, and Andy sat there alone, a man, finally himself, a man, finally alone. Some nights he was not sure which of the two he would have chosen had anyone thought to tell him the price. There was one, though, who didn't draw back. The child still climbed onto the bench beside him, still held up two of everything and asked which he liked, and she listened now, to answers that belonged to no one on earth but him. She'd never been warm to the coats. She had only ever been warm to the man. And one small person, who truly knew him, Andy found, kept him warmer than the whole village of coats ever had. He gave the coats back, in the end, one at a time. The miller's certainty, the innkeeper's grievances, all of it, returned to the hands that had first held it out. Fewer people came to sit with him than once had. His days were quieter after that, and smaller and colder than they had ever been. But the few who came now came for him, for the man, and not the coat. So let me ask you, the rooms that are always warm to you, are they warm to you? Or to the coat that you put on each morning before you walk in? And if you took the coats off tomorrow, or if you finally said the one thing that was only ever yours, who would stay? And the closet by his door, it stood nearly empty now. On the hook, where a dozen coats had once hung heavy, there was a single coat left, thin and plain, and worn soft at the elbows. It kept out very little of the cold, but every last thread of it was his own. If this reached something deep inside of you, stay a while. There's another story here waiting. Please like, share, and subscribe for more ancient wisdom without fluff.